Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from history's forgotten past. Tonight, we bring you a haunting tale from 1872, the chilling mystery of Emily Crawford, the girl who spoke with spirits. In the late autumn of 1872, the small towns of New England carried a quiet rhythm of horse hooves on dirt roads and the slow chiming of church bells calling farmers and their families to Sunday sermons. The Civil War had ended just a few years before, yet the grief of lost sons still lingered in the shadows of wooden farmhouses and in the black shawls of widows. Walking through graveyards, the nation was scarred but struggling to move forward, and in the midst of that restless time of mourning came stories of young girls who claimed to hear voices from beyond the grave. Emily Crawford was one of those girls. She was not born into wealth or fame, but to a modest family in Connecticut. Her father was a shoemaker with calloused hands who worked long hours in a small shop attached to their house, and her mother was a quiet woman who spent her days keeping the home clean, tending to a garden, and teaching Emily too. So they lived simply but carried within their home a sadness that could never quite be shaken. Emily had been only 10 years old when her older brother, Samuel, marched away with the Union Army. He had been just 17, tall, with proud shoulders, but too young for the weight of war. He never returned, and in the summer of 1864, a letter came back with his name written carefully across the front, but inside only words of death and sorrow. Emily's mother wept for weeks, and Emily herself never forgot the day her brother's boots sat by the door unworn and silent. By the time Emily was 15, she had grown into a pale girl with deep gray eyes that seemed older than her years. She had a habit of staring into the fire at night or sitting in the yard long after dark, listening as if to some sound only she could hear. She was not a loud child nor mischievous like some others in town. She carried herself with an odd stillness, a strange mix of gentleness and distance. People in the neighborhood whispered about her, saying the Crawford girl was peculiar, perhaps touched by grief too deeply or too quiet for her own good. But what none of them knew was that Emily claimed she could hear Samuel's voice even after he was buried in the cold earth. Began with whispers soft and low that drifted into her ears at night. She told her mother that she had heard Samuel calling her name just before sleep, a voice as clear as it had been when he was alive. Her mother hushed her quickly, telling her not to speak of such things, but Emily insisted she heard him again and again, sometimes in the still of morning, sometimes in the hush of night. She said Samuel told her things she could not possibly know. One evening, when her father misplaced a hammer and could not find it, Emily spoke quietly, "Go to the second shelf in the shop near the loose board," and sure enough, the hammer was there, where her father swore he had never placed it. Her mother grew pale, but said nothing. Was not long before neighbors began to take notice, for word spreads quickly in a small town. The widow Miller down the road had lost her husband at Gettysburg. She came to call on Mrs. Crawford, and Emily sat at the table quietly listening. Then, without warning, she looked at the widow and said, "Your Henry says not to weep so much. He says he rests in peace under the oak where the cannon fire last fell." The widow Miller broke down sobbing and swore that was the very place Henry had written of in his last letter. No one had ever told Emily of it. The townspeople began to murmur more loudly. Some believed the girl had a gift, a heavenly channel to the dead. Others said she was wicked, or worse, that she dabbled with spirits not of God. In 1872, America was no stranger to such beliefs. The spiritualist movement was spreading across the nation, with seances in parlors and mediums claiming to speak for the lost and grieving. Many families torn by the Civil War clung to the hope of hearing their sons' voices once more. Yet in small rural towns, such practices were viewed with suspicion and fear. One cold evening in November, Emily was asked to attend a gathering at the home of the Whitakers, a well-to-do family who had lost 2 sons in the war. Emily was nervous, but her mother pressed her hands and said softly, "Perhaps it is the Lord's work you are doing, child." When Emily entered, the parlor candles flickered on the mantel, shadows danced against the wallpaper, and the family gathered close. The room held the scent of oil lamps and old books. Emily closed her eyes, as she had done many nights before, and whispered names as though they were not her own. She spoke of battles she had never studied, of cries of young men dying in fields she had never walked. Mrs. Whitaker fell to her knees, weeping that her boys were safe with God, and the family insisted Emily had been touched by heaven. From that night on, Emily's name began to spread beyond her town. Strangers arrived by wagon to see the girl medium. They asked her questions about their dead sons, husbands, and fathers. She spoke words that rang too true to be mere guesses, sometimes giving details she could not have known. They left her house trembling with tears, or with wide, fearful eyes, unsure if what they had heard was holy or unholy, but never doubting that it was real yet. For Emily, the voices did not bring peace. They left her weary, trembling, and often sick after long sessions. She felt drained, her hands icy cold, her lips dry and cracked. She began to dream strange dreams of shadowed rooms and fields of the dead. She saw her brother Samuel, not only at night, but sometimes in broad daylight, his figure standing near the barn, his hand reaching for hers. She longed for him, yet feared the strangeness of it all. The local pastor, Reverend Jacobs, grew uneasy about the talk that spread through town. He preached against false prophets and the danger of spirits that wore the masks of loved ones. He warned that Satan himself could appear as an angel of light. His sermons grew harsher each Sunday, and his eyes often found Emily sitting pale and small in the back pew. The whispers in town turned sharper. Some claimed she was blessed. Others called her cursed. Children whispered cruel names as she walked past their schoolyard. Yet families still came, desperate families who wanted nothing more than to hear a last word from those buried too soon. Emily herself felt torn. She wanted only to bring comfort, but each time she opened her lips, she felt a weight pressing down upon her chest, as though the voices demanded something she could not understand. Her mother prayed over her nightly, asking God to shield her, but even prayer seemed to leave Emily restless. Her father avoided speaking of it altogether. He buried himself in his work, yet sometimes he looked at Emily with an expression of fear, as though she were no longer quite his daughter. By December of that year, stories of Emily reached beyond Connecticut and into Boston, where newspapers occasionally carried strange tales to fill their pages. One article mentioned a young girl who spoke with the dead, her eyes clouded by visions, her words filled with truths that shook grieving families. Many dismissed it as another case of hysteria or rural superstition, but others believed and wanted to see her for themselves. Curiosity seekers arrived, journalists, skeptics, and even learned men who wished to test the girl's powers. Emily was only 16, and yet the weight of the world seemed to press down upon her shoulders. One night, a group of visitors gathered in the Crawford home, among them a journalist with sharp eyes and a notebook. Emily sat at the table, her hands folded before her. The lamps dimmed the room. Silent, except for the ticking of a clock, she closed her eyes, and her lips began to move slowly. Almost painfully, she spoke of a soldier named Thomas, who had fallen at Antietam. She described the exact slope of the hill where he lay, and the torn ribbon his wife had placed in his pocket before he left for war. His widow gasped and fainted, for she had never spoken of that ribbon to anyone. The Zernus wrote quickly, his brow furrowed. He could not explain what he had seen. That winter snow blanketed the Crawford home, and the voices came more often. Emily grew thin, her cheeks hollow, her skin pale against the white of the snow. Her mother grew more frightened as the girl often awoke, screaming in the night, claiming she felt cold hands grasping her wrists, or heard Samuel's voice urging her to follow him beyond the veil. She began to fear that her daughter was slipping further into some realm that no living soul should tread. Yet still they came, wagons crunching over the snow, strangers with heavy coats and heavier hearts, seeking the girl who spoke with spirits, each left with their own tale. Some called it divine, others whispered of witchcraft, but all agreed the Crawford girl was unlike any they had ever met her. Mystery grew, and with it the unease of the town that did not know whether to revere her or to fear her. The winter of 1872 pressed heavily upon the small, Connecticut town. The winds blew sharp across the empty fields and chimneys, breathed smoke into gray skies. Families huddled around stoves to keep warm, while horses stood with snow on their backs, waiting outside wooden barns. Yet inside the Crawford home, the cold that lingered was not only from the weather, it was the kind of cold that crept into the soul, a silence broken too often by whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Emily grew thinner as the days shortened. Her eyes appeared darker, her face shadowed by sleepless nights. Her mother wrapped shawls around her shoulders, but Emily often pushed them aside, saying she felt no warmth no matter how many fires were lit. She spent hours by the window, staring into the yard where snow lay untouched, her lips sometimes moving as if in quiet conversation, though no one else was near. At times her mother found her in the barn, speaking softly into the still air, as though answering questions from an unseen visitor. When pressed, Emily said it was Samuel, but she said it in a tone both loving and afraid. The town could not turn away from her story. Curiosity seekers kept arriving by sleigh and wagon. The Crawfords were not wealthy, yet their humble home became a gathering place for the broken-hearted women who had lost sons at Shiloh, men who had lost brothers at Fredericksburg. Even children who missed fathers buried in southern soil came to the door, knocking timidly with letters or locks of hair, asking if Emily might call forth their voices. Emily sat at the table, pale and trembling, but her words came all the same. She spoke of details she could not have known, lullabies sung long ago, childhood pets, secret phrases spoken between lovers. She spoke them in whispers that sent shivers through the room. The Reverend Jacobs grew more furious with each passing week. His sermons thundered from the pulpit, warning against the Crawford girl. He declared that the devil wore familiar faces, and that grief was the doorway by which he entered the homes of good Christians. He warned the town that Emily's words were not of God, but of Satan himself. Some nodded in agreement, clutching their Bibles, but others wept quietly in their pews, longing to believe that the voices of their dead were not lost forever. Rumors swirled in the cold air. Some said Emily had been chosen as a prophet. Others claimed she was a witch destined for damnation. One neighbor swore he saw lights flickering from the Crawford barn late one night, as though a lantern burned, though no one was inside. Another swore she had heard two voices whispering when only Emily was in the yard. The Crawfords found themselves both pitied and shunned. Families came secretly under cover of darkness to seek Emily's gift, yet by daylight many of those same families crossed the street to avoid speaking to her mother. It was in January that a group of men from Boston arrived, scholars, as they called themselves. Though some were little more than skeptics, with a hunger for spectacle, they carried notebooks and instruments, small bells and polished trumpets used in seances. They said they had heard of Emily and wished to test her gift. They pressed silver coins into Mr. Crawford's hand. Though he resisted at first, Emily was seated in the parlor. Once again, candles dim, her hands folded before her. The men asked questions in quick, sharp voices, demanding details about soldiers long dead. Emily's face went pale, her breathing shallow. She closed her eyes, and then her lips parted. She spoke of a man named Elias, who had died near Richmond. She described his uniform, his wound, the way he had called for his mother at the last moment. One of the men gasped and rose from his chair, knocking it over, for it was his very own brother. Emily had never met him nor heard his name. But after that evening, Emily collapsed to the floor, trembling violently. Her mother screamed and fell beside her, trying to wake her. It was more than an hour before she stirred. When she opened her eyes, they were filled with tears. She whispered that the voices were pulling her away, pulling her somewhere she was not meant to go. She begged her mother to make them stop. Crawfords debated locking their door to all visitors, but desperation has a way of finding its path, even through bolted doors. Neighbors knocked on windows, calling for Emily, begging for a moment with their loved ones. Her father grew harsh, his voice trembling as he told them to leave, but still they returned, some weeping, some angry, some leaving small gifts on the porch. In fence, Thanks or in guilt, Emily herself seemed torn, for she felt pity for the grieving, yet each encounter left her weaker one. Bitter night. Emily awoke, screaming, her voice cutting through the house. She said. Samuel stood at the foot of her bed, his face pale, his eyes dark. He told her that she must come with him beyond the veil, that there was no place for her among the living. Her mother clutched her tightly, rocking her in her arms, whispering prayers until dawn came, pale through the frost-covered windows. Story of the girl who spoke with spirits had grown too large for the small town to contain, and in February, a newspaper from Boston printed a full column about her, calling her the girl medium of Connecticut. It described her as a frail child, blessed with visions of the afterlife. It mentioned families who had found peace in her words and skeptics who had been silenced by her accuracy. It spoke in wonder but also in fear, saying only time would tell whether her gift was divine or damned. Copies of the paper spread quickly. Men in taverns spoke of her name. Women at markets whispered of her as they bought flour and sugar. The Crawfords could no longer live in quiet anonymity. Reverend Jacobs decided to act. He called upon the deacons and elders of the church, demanding that they confront the Crawfords. He declared that the girl was in danger, that her soul was being taken by the devil himself. A meeting was held in the church basement, the air damp and cold, the lamps flickering. As the men spoke, some argued that servient, argued that Emily's words had brought comfort and could not be evil. Others said comfort was the very trap by which Satan lured the weak. It was decided that Emily must be tested by the church. Word reached the Crawfords quickly, and fear filled their home. Emily's mother wept, saying her daughter was no witch. Her father grew grim, but silent. Emily herself only nodded quietly, saying, if they wish to test me, then let them, perhaps they will understand. Yet her hands shook as she spoke. The day of the test, the church was filled with townspeople pressing close into the pews, the air heavy with tension. Reverend Jacobs stood at the pulpit, his Bible in hand. Emily sat in the front, pale, her hair brushed back, her eyes lowered. The Reverend asked her to pray aloud, to ask God for strength. She did so, her voice trembling. He then demanded that she call upon her brother Samuel, if she truly heard him. Emily's lips parted slowly. She whispered his name, and then her voice changed. It grew stronger, deeper. She spoke words that were not her own, words of battle and blood, words of farewell and pain. The crowd gasped. Some cried out in fear, some in awe. The Reverend's face grew red. He slammed his hand upon the pulpit, declaring it a trick. Yet no trick could explain the tears streaming down the faces of the mothers who swore those words belonged to their sons. Molly collapsed again, her body trembling, her eyes rolling back. She was carried from the church by her father, while her mother followed. Weeping, the crowd erupted into shouting, half demanding she be cast out, half demanding she be left in peace. From that day, the town was divided. The Crawford family found themselves at the center of a storm. The weeks that followed brought no peace. Emily's health faltered. She often lay in bed for hours, unable to rise. She grew paler, thinner, her voice faint. She said Samuel came more often now, his face shadowed and stern. She said he warned her that the voices would never leave her, that she belonged to them more than to the living. Her mother prayed harder. Her father sat silent, his pipe in hand, staring into the fire as though searching for answers. He could not speak aloud. One evening, as snow fell thick against the windows, a group of strangers arrived. They were not grieving widows or curious neighbors, but men in black coats with notebooks. They called themselves investigators of spiritual phenomena. They had traveled from New York. They wished to witness the girl medium. Emily was too weak, but her father allowed them inside, for they promised not to press her too hard. They set up instruments in the parlor, small trumpets, wires, bells, and a dark curtain. They asked Emily to sit. She obeyed, though her hands shook. The lamps were dimmed. The men began to speak, calling upon spirits, asking for signs. Suddenly, the bell rang, though no one touched it. The trumpet lifted slightly from the table, and Emily's face grew rigid. She spoke in a voice not her own, deep and sorrowful. The men wrote quickly. Astonished, one whispered, "This is genuine." But when it ended, Emily fell silent, her eyes wide and empty. She did not speak again for hours. When at last she stirred, she clutched her mother's hand, whispering that she felt she was fading, that she was slipping into a place from which she might not return. Her mother begged the men to leave. They did so, reluctantly, leaving behind their notes and a sense of triumph. By March the snow began to melt, yet in the Crawford home spring brought no renewal, only dread. Emily grew weaker, her visions darker. She no longer smiled, even faintly. Her mother rarely left her side. The town still argued. Some called her cursed, some called her blessed, but all watched as the girl who spoke with spirits seemed to waste away. Her mystery had grown, but at a terrible cost. By the time the thaw of early spring reached Connecticut, the fields turned from white to brown, the snow melting into muddy ruts that slowed wagons and stained boots. But in the Crawford home, time seemed to stand still. The air inside was thick with the smell of tallow candles and damp wood smoke. Emily spent more days in bed, her body weak, her skin so pale she looked as if she were already fading into another world. Her mother sat by her side, reading softly from the Bible, holding her hand. Yet, even as the holy words were spoken, Emily's eyes wandered, as though listening to someone else, someone no one else could hear. Neighbors still came, though less often now. The sight of the girl frightened them nearly as much as it moved them. Some whispered that she looked like a ghost herself, her eyes too large, her frame too thin, her lips pale as wax. Others said she was paying the price for speaking with the dead, that no one could cross that threshold without leaving part of themselves behind. Sometimes she agreed with them. In quiet moments she told her mother that Samuel called more insistently, that his voice was louder than ever before. She said he no longer begged her to listen, but commanded. She said he told her that she belonged to him in death, not to the living in life. Crawfords did not know where to turn. Reverend Jacob still thundered against her from the pulpit, warning that the devil sought to claim her soul. Yet others defended her, saying she had brought peace to the grieving. The town grew divided, sharper than ever, the tavern filled with arguments, the marketplace with whispers. Even children quarreled about her. One boy shouted that she was a witch, and another swore she was blessed by God. Fights broke out in the schoolyard until teachers dragged the children apart. A Boston newspaper that had written of her months earlier returned with another story, this time darker than before. It spoke of a girl wasting away under the weight of her visions. It hinted at danger, saying the line between life and death was not meant to be crossed. Readers devoured the article. The name Emily Crawford traveled beyond New England into New York, Pennsylvania, and even farther. Families wrote letters addressed simply to the girl medium of Connecticut. Some begged for guidance, others cursed her as a fraud or a servant of the devil. The postman delivered stacks of letters to the Crawford door. Some opened, some left unopened on the table, as the family could not bear to read them. All Emily herself grew quieter when she did speak. It was often not in her own voice. Sometimes her words carried the tone of a soldier, sometimes of a child, sometimes of a weeping mother. Her father once sat across the room, his hands trembling as she spoke, in Samuel's voice, repeating a phrase he alone had heard his son say in their shop years earlier. He left the room in silence, tears running into his beard, his pipe forgotten on the table. Afterward, he sat long into the night, staring into the fire, saying nothing. It was during those weeks that Emily began to see more than hear. She told her mother that figures moved at the edge of her vision, shadows drifting across the room. When no one else was there, she said they stood in the corners of the house, near the bed, near the barn, sometimes near her father's shop. She described their faces pale and sorrowful, their clothes torn by war and mud. Her mother begged her not to speak of such things, yet Emily could not help it. She said they called to her, they lifted their hands as though beckoning her to follow her. Sleep grew restless, filled with violent dreams. She woke screaming, almost nightly sometimes, gasping for Air as though drowning, sometimes clawing at her blankets as though someone were pulling her down. Her mother lit lamps and prayed aloud. Her father paced the floorboards with heavy steps, unable to quiet his daughter's torment. By April, the townspeople spoke of little else. Some feared she would die before the spring flowers bloomed. Others whispered she would vanish entirely, taken into the spirit world, leaving only an empty bed. Her mother clung to her with desperate arms. Her father shut himself away in his shop, working late into the night, hammering leather until his hands bled, as though he could drown out the voices with noise. But Emily could not escape the voices. One evening, as rain struck the roof, she told her mother that Samuel had come again, more real than ever, she said. He stood at her bedside, his hand cold as stone, his eyes hollow. She said he told her that the living had no claim upon her anymore, that she must cross the river with him. Her mother wept, begging her to fight it. Emily only whispered that she was so tired, so very tired. The family grew desperate. They sought the advice of doctors, though few had much to offer. One physician from Hartford examined Emily and said she suffered from nervous exhaustion, that her imagination had been inflamed by grief. He recommended rest tonics and fresh air, but such remedies brought no relief. Another doctor suggested she be taken away from the town, that the talk around her only deepened her condition. But the Crawfords could not imagine leaving their home. Others said bluntly that nothing could be done. The spiritualist investigators who had visited months before wrote letters urging the family to hold them another session. They claimed they could help channel the forces that plagued Emily, perhaps even free her. Her father refused, but Emily herself grew curious. She told her mother that perhaps if she allowed them to come, she might finally understand what was happening. The Crawfords debated long into the night. At last, they agreed, though reluctantly. The men arrived again, this time with more equipment: small tables, trumpets, wires, even a camera, which they claimed could capture the forms of spirits. They set up in the parlor, closing the curtains. The lamps dimmed the air, heavy with tobacco and candle smoke. Emily sat in the chair, her hands folded, her face pale. The men began to call out, asking for spirits to make themselves known. The trumpet shivered, the bell rang faintly, the camera clicked. In the dark, one man whispered that he saw a pale hand resting on Emily's shoulder, though no one else saw it. Then Emily's body stiffened, her head tilted back, and a voice deep and mournful came from her lips. It was Samuel again, speaking of war, of pain, of longing for home. Her mother collapsed into sobs, but the investigators only leaned closer, scribbling notes, whispering to one another. When it ended, Emily was weaker than ever. She collapsed in her mother's arms, barely breathing, her lips pale, her body cold. The men left with their notes and their strange satisfaction, but the Crawfords were left with a daughter who seemed closer to death with each passing day. Rumors spread that photographs had been taken, that images showed ghostly shapes near Emily's body. One paper in New York even printed a blurred picture, claiming it showed the face of a soldier hovering above. The girl skeptics scoffed, but believers saw in it proof that she truly walked with the dead. The story spread farther than ever, now reaching across the country, but fame did not bring comfort. Emily's days were filled with silence, broken only by whispers, her nights with dreams that left her gasping. Her mother prayed, her father worked, but both feared that their daughter was slipping away. Each day her steps grew slower, her words fewer, her eyes darker. She said she no longer knew when she was awake or when she was dreaming. She said she felt herself pulled between two worlds, neither fully here nor fully gone. The spring rains fell heavy that year, flooding the fields, turning dirt roads into rivers. Yet in the Crawford home, the air grew heavy with dread. Families still came, though fewer than before, some too frightened by her frail appearance. Others convinced she was cursed, yet those who came swore her words were more powerful than ever. One widow fainted when Emily repeated the last words her husband had spoken on his deathbed, words he had whispered only once in her ear. No one could explain how the girl could have known. By May, the town no longer knew what to think. Reverend Jacobs continued to denounce her, But some of his own congregation slipped away at night to the Crawford home, seeking what comfort he could not give thee. Town was divided beyond repair. Neighbors once friendly now eyed each other with suspicion. Some whispered of sending the girl away. Some whispered of burning the Crawford barn as a place of evil, but others swore to defend her, saying she was no witch but a messenger of God herself. Emily grew too weak to rise from her bed. She lay staring at the ceiling, whispering. Two voices no one else could hear. She told her mother that Samuel was no longer alone, that others came to dozens of them, soldiers in torn uniforms, mothers clutching infants, children with hollow eyes. She said they filled her room at night, standing silently in the corners, their faces pale, their voices low. She said they begged her to come with them. Her mother wept, begging God to spare her child, but Emily only closed her eyes, whispering that perhaps she would finally rest when she crossed that threshold. She said the living world felt heavier with each breath, as though she were carrying a weight too great for her frail body. She said the voices were not cruel, but insistent that they loved her, but also claimed her. The Crawford home grew quieter than ever. The sound of wagons outside seemed distant, the laughter of children in the fields far away. It was as though the house itself had slipped into a different world, one of shadows and whispers, a place caught between life and death. In that silence, Emily Crawford waited, her body, frail her soul, restless her family, torn between faith and fear, the town divided. Her story spreading farther each week as newspapers carried her name, yet none could say what would become of the girl who spoke with spirits. The summer of 1872 came warm and bright to Connecticut fields, green again after the spring rains, children chasing each other through tall grass, farmers driving their horses through furrows as though the dark days of war had never been yet. For the Crawford home, the change in season brought no relief. The air inside was heavy, not with heat alone, but with the shadow of something unshakable. Emily lay thin as parchment, her gray eyes large in her pale face. She rarely left her bed, and when she did, she moved slowly, her feet dragging her body as though each step pulled her deeper into another world. Her mother tended her day and night, spooning broth between her lips, brushing damp hair from her forehead, whispering prayers over her. Father grew older in those months, his shoulders bent, his hair graying faster than before. He no longer worked as much in the shop, often sitting silently by the window, staring across the fields as though waiting for something inevitable. Both parents loved their daughter fiercely, yet both feared what they saw her slipping, not toward recovery, but toward an end that seemed written in every whispered word she spoke. Neighbors came less often. By summer, fear kept many away. The Reverend's words grew sharper than ever. He thundered from the pulpit that Emily was an abomination, that she was being claimed by the devil and would drag the whole town with her if left unchecked. He warned that the Crawfords themselves were complicit in harboring her gift. Some whispered that he meant to have her cast out, but others were too moved by pity and love to let such a thing happen. Still, letters arrived by the dozens. Families from as far as Ohio and Virginia begged for her help. Some offered money, others only desperate words, but Emily no longer answered letters. She was too weak to drained. She whispered only to her mother and father of visions that grew stranger each day. She said Samuel no longer came alone, but now walked with hosts of other soldiers with hollow eyes, mothers clutching their children, children with broken bodies. She said they filled her room at night, pressing close, whispering in a chorus that grew louder each week. She said they called to her, begged her, demanded her presence among them. At times, she tried to resist. She prayed aloud, her voice thin and weak, begging God to save her. But her words faltered, her eyes rolled back, and she whispered instead, in voices that were not her own. At times, her lips spoke Latin, though she had never been taught. At other times, she cried like an infant. Though her body lay still, her mother wept. Her father clenched his fists, pacing the room, unable to strike at shadows that no living hand could touch. July, a man arrived from Boston carrying another newspaper article about Emily. This one harsher than before. It called her case a tragedy and a fraud, accusing her parents of exploiting her for attention or coin, though the Crawfords had gained nothing from her suffering. The article mocked the believers and praised Reverend Jacobs for speaking out against her. It painted Emily as a symbol of the dangers of superstition in an age meant for science and progress. The Crawfords read it with bitterness and sorrow. But Emily only smiled faintly, whispering that soon none of it would matter her. Visions grew sharper, her words more haunting. She told her mother that Samuel had reached out his hand to her, and that this time she had touched it, she said his hand was cold and heavy like stone, yet she felt her own hand sink into his as though no barrier remained between them. She said she no longer feared it. She said she felt peace in the thought of leaving this world behind. Her mother begged her not to speak. So her father shouted for her to hold on, but Emily only smiled faintly, whispering that she heard music beyond the voices, soft and beautiful music, unlike any she had known. By late August, Emily rarely opened her eyes for long. She drifted between waking and sleep, between silence and whispers. Sometimes her lips moved, though no sound came. Her mother swore she saw her daughter's eyes follow things in the room unseen to her. She swore she felt the air grow colder around the bed at night. She prayed harder, her voice breaking in desperation. She begged God to spare her child, to break the chain that pulled her toward the grave, but still the hours passed without change. Town could not ignore her, even as they pretended to turn away. Children whispered ghost stories in the schoolyard, using her name as though she were already dead. Men at the tavern argued whether she was a fraud, a saint, or something darker. Women carried tales to the market, some saying she was cursed, others saying she was blessed. Her name had grown beyond the town, beyond the state, carried in newspapers and letters, yet her body lay still in a small room, her life shrinking to a thread. One night in September, thunder shook the house, a storm rolling across the hills, lightning flashing through the window. Emily stirred, her eyes opening wide for the first time in days. She whispered her brother's name, her lips trembling. She said Samuel was here, that he had come for her. Her mother clutched her hand, begging her to stay. Her father pressed his palm to her forehead, whispering her name, but Emily only smiled faintly and whispered that she could see fields filled with soldiers standing silent, that she could see mothers with their children smiling through tears, that she could see a river shining in the dark. She said they were waiting for her. She said they were calling her home. Her body shivered once, then lay still. Her mother screamed, her father wept, both clutching her lifeless hand. The storm outside raged on, thunder, rolling, lightning flashing, as though the heavens themselves marked the passing of the girl who spoke with spirits. The days that followed were filled with sorrow. The town gathered quietly, though divided still. Some mourned her as a tragic child lost to grief. Others whispered that her death was proof of God's judgment. Her coffin was plain wood. Her father carved it with his own hands, his tears falling onto the shavings. Her mother placed a lock of Samuel's hair inside beside her daughter's still face. The funeral was small, yet heavy with emotion. The Reverend spoke only briefly, his words sharp and cold, yet the mothers who had once wept at Emily's words wept again at her grave, dropping flowers into the earth, as though laying down their final thanks. Her story did not end with her burial. Newspapers across the country printed her name, some calling her a fraud, others a miracle, some painting her as a victim of ignorance, others as a symbol of faith gone too far. Skeptics wrote columns, believers wrote prayers. Spiritualist circles spoke of her as proof of the veil between worlds. The truth could not be settled then, and has never been settled since. For the Crawfords, their home was never the same. Her father worked less and less, his tools gathering dust. Her mother carried her Bible always, but her hands trembled too much to read at night. The house seemed too quiet to empty the voices that once filled it, gone, yet the silence heavier. Still, years later, some in town swore they still saw her figure walking the yard at dusk, a pale girl with long hair, her head tilted as though listening to Something just beyond hearing others said they heard whispers when passing the Crawford home. Whispers that rose and fell, like the voices of the dead, whether truth or rumor, no one could say, but the memory of Emily Crawford never faded. She became part of the larger story of America in that restless age after the Civil War, when grief was still raw, and the hunger for voices from beyond was stronger than reason. She was one of many child mediums, yet her name lingered because her story carried the weight of sorrow, of faith, of fear, and of mystery. She was not the first nor the last, but she was remembered as the girl who spoke with spirits, a child whose voice carried across the divide between the living and the dead. And so her mystery remains. Was Emily Crawford truly a vessel for voices beyond the grave, or was she a child, consumed by grief and shaped by the desperate hopes of those around her? Was she cursed by a darkness that preyed upon her, or blessed with a gift she never asked to carry? The answer has been lost to time, buried with her in the autumn earth of. But her story lives on in the whispers of history, in the hushed tones of old newspapers, in the memories of a town that once stood divided between fear and faith. The girl who spoke with spirits, Emily Crawford, her name carved not in stone alone, but in the shadows of American history, where grief and mystery walk hand in hand, and where the past refuses ever truly to rest.